Hey everyone, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what's going on with this crazy used car market. Prices are sky high, and it feels like you need a map and a compass just to find a decent deal. Well, today we're going deep. We're going to take a look at how one company, NexGear Capital, might be having a huge impact on the prices you see at the dealership. Our source for all this is a podcast called Industry Exposed. So, good some pretty interesting insider info here.
A lot of people haven't even heard of NexGear Capital, but they're a really big player in the used car world. They do something called floor plan financing.
Floor plan financing. That sounds kind of complicated.
Oh, it's actually pretty simple. Imagine you're a used car dealer. You need to have like a lot full of cars to sell, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
But those cars can be expensive. So that's where NexGear comes in. They provide loans to dealerships so they can buy all those cars for their inventory. It's basically like a giant credit card for car dealers.
Okay, so they're the bank behind the used car lot. But how does that give them so much power?
Well, that's where things get interesting. NexGear is owned by Cox Automotive.
Cox Automotive,
And Cox Automotive also owns Manheim Auctions.
Manheim. Yeah, they're like the giant used car auction place, right? Where dealerships
Yeah.
go to buy their inventory.
Exactly. So Cox Automotive controls two huge parts of the used car market: the financing through NexGear and the supply of cars through Manheim.
Wow, so they're kind of like controlling both sides of the deal.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's why some people are worried.
I see what you mean. But isn't it also good for business to have, a reliable source of financing and a big marketplace for cars?
That's definitely true. It can make things a lot easier for dealerships. But it's important to think about the potential downsides too, especially for those smaller independent dealerships you see all over the place.
You're right. I've noticed that a lot of smaller used car dealerships have closed down over the years. Is there a connection?
It's hard to say for sure,
Hmm.
but there are concerns about how NexGear's lending practices might be affecting these smaller dealerships.
Okay, let's talk numbers. How much are we talking about with these loans?
Well, it really depends on the size of the dealership and the types of cars they sell. But we're talking hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars for some dealerships.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
And on top of that, there are interest rates and fees that dealerships have to pay.
I bet those fees can add up.
Oh yeah, especially for smaller dealerships. They might not have the same negotiating power as the big guys.
So what happens if a small dealership is struggling to make those payments?
Well, if a dealership falls behind, NexGear can actually repossess the cars.
That sounds pretty harsh. Like, what if they're just a little bit behind?
It can definitely be tough for smaller businesses, especially if they're operating on thin margins.
Yeah, like kicking them when they're already down.
Exactly.
So I'm starting to see the potential problem here. NexGear, with all its money and its connection to Manheim, has a lot of leverage over these smaller dealerships.
Precisely. And that brings us to the big question. Why should you, the listener, care about all of this?
Yeah, how does this whole corporate tug-of-war affect me when I'm just trying to find a decent used car?
Well, think about it this way. If smaller dealerships are struggling to stay afloat, what does that mean for competition in the market?
Less competition.
Yeah.
So fewer choices for consumers,
Right.
and fewer choices usually lead to.
Higher prices.
Oh, that's what I was afraid of.
When you have fewer dealerships competing for your business, they have more power to set prices.
So it's not just about the sticker price on a car. It's about the whole system that influences that price.
Exactly. It's like the tip of the iceberg. You see the price, but you don't see all the stuff that went into creating that price.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But is it all bad? Are there any good things about this situation?
Well, some people argue that large-scale financing and auction systems can bring benefits too.
Like what?
For example, think about a new dealership trying to enter the market. NexGear could make it easier for them to get the financing they need to get started, and Manheim could make it easier for them to find a wide variety of inventory.
Okay, so there could be some positives for new businesses, but I'm still worried about the potential negative impact on competition and consumers like me. What can be done to make this system fairer?
Well, one idea is to increase transparency. If lenders like NexGear were required to be more upfront about their fees and interest rates, it could help level the playing field.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like nutrition labels on food.
Exactly. And another solution is to create regulations that protect smaller dealerships.
So, like setting limits on interest rates or fees.
Right. The goal is to prevent lenders from taking advantage of smaller dealerships.
That sounds like a good step in the right direction. But those things take time, and people still need to buy cars now. So what can consumers do to protect themselves in this current system?
That's a great question. And it's a perfect lead-in to our next discussion. Now that we've got a clearer picture of how NextGear works and the potential implications, let's talk about some practical tips for navigating this market and finding the best deals.
All right, listeners, get ready to take notes. We're about to drop some serious car buying knowledge.
All right, let's bring this to life with an example. Imagine a small used car dealership, maybe in a city like Chicago. They've been a part of the community for years, offering good cars at affordable prices. They get their cars from Manheim Auctions, and like a lot of dealerships, they use NextGear for financing.
Okay, I can picture it. A family-owned business, friendly salespeople. Maybe they sponsor the local Little League team.
Right, exactly. Now imagine the economy takes a downturn. People aren't buying cars as quickly, and this dealership starts having trouble making their monthly payments to NextGear.
Uh-oh. I see where this is going. They fall behind on payments, and NextGear comes knocking.
Yep. And remember, those loans can be huge. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes even more.
So what happens? Does NextGear try to work with them? Or do they just take back all the cars?
Well, you'd hope they would try to work something out, but some people say NextGear is pretty quick to repossess those cars.
And where do those cars end up?
Back at Manheim Auctions, most likely.
So Cox Automotive makes money coming and going.
Yeah, it's a system that some people find pretty concerning.
Feels like the house always wins.
That's the worry. This kind of setup could trap smaller dealerships in a cycle of debt. They need the cars to make money. But if they can't make the payments, they lose the cars. And then it's even harder to get back on their feet.
It's like they're stuck in quicksand. But how does all this actually affect the price I pay for a car?
Well, let's say that dealership in Chicago had to close down because they couldn't keep up with next year's payments. Now you have one less dealership in the area.
And one less dealership means less competition. This
Exactly.
means I have less power to negotiate.
Right. And some people argue that even if those dealerships don't go out of business, they still might have to raise their prices to cover those high interest rates and fees.
Even if it's not directly on the sticker price, NextGear's practices could still be driving up the cost of used cars.
It's certainly a possibility.
And it's not just about the price. What about the types of cars those smaller dealerships sell?
That's a great point. They often specialize in more affordable cars, the kind of cars everyday people rely on.
Yeah, they're catering to a different customer than the folks buying brand new SUVs.
Exactly. So if those smaller dealerships are struggling, it could make it harder for some people to find affordable transportation.
It's not just about money. It's about making sure everyone has access to a reliable car.
That's a really important point. And this brings us to a bigger question about the role of big corporations. When one company has so much control over an industry, it raises concerns about fairness and balance.
I get it. It's like having only one internet provider. You're stuck with whatever they offer, even if it's terrible and expensive.
That's a great analogy. And some argue that this kind of concentration of power can actually stifle innovation and limit consumer choice.
Okay, this is all pretty concerning, but is there anything we can do about it? Or are we just stuck with this system?
Well, some people are pushing for solutions to make things more fair.
Give me some hope here.
One idea we've already mentioned is greater transparency. If NextGear had to be more open about its lending practices, it might be harder for them to take advantage of smaller dealerships.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's shine some light on those shady practices.
Exactly. And another idea is to create regulations that specifically protect smaller dealerships.
So things like limits on interest rates and fees.
Exactly. The goal is to give smaller dealerships a fair chance to compete.
Those sound like good ideas. But in the meantime, what can I do as a consumer?
That's a perfect question to transition to our next topic. Now that we understand the big picture, let's dive into some practical tips for buying a used car in this complex market.
Okay, listeners, grab your notepads. We're about to get into the nitty-gritty of finding a great used car without getting ripped off.
The most important thing is to be an informed consumer. Do your research before you even go to a dealership.
Research.
Exactly. Figure out what kind of car you need, what features are important to you, and what you can actually afford.
Don't just fall in love with the first shiny car you see.
Right. And once you've got a few models in mind, use websites like Kelley Blue Book or Edmunds to get an idea of the fair market value.
Oh yeah, those are great websites. They can give you a realistic price range for the car you want.
Exactly. Knowing the fair market value gives you a huge advantage when you start negotiating with dealerships.
So I'm armed with knowledge, I know what kind of car I want, and I know how much it should cost. What's next?
Next, Shop around. Don't just go to the first dealership you see. Visit a few different places, compare prices, and get a feel for the salespeople.
Okay, so it's like dating. Don't settle for the first person you meet.
Exactly. Take your time and find the dealership that feels right for you.
And I'm not obligated to buy just because I test drove a car, right?
Absolutely not. You're in control. And one of the best ways to be in control is to get pre-approved for a loan from your bank or credit union.
Pre-approval, that's a great tip. How does that work?
It's pretty simple. Before you go car shopping, apply for a loan through your bank or credit union. If you're approved, they'll tell you how much you can borrow and at what interest rate.
So I can walk into the dealership knowing exactly how much I can spend.
Right. And it shows the dealership that you're a serious buyer. You're not at their mercy when it comes to financing.
I like it. I'm coming to the table with my own cards.
Exactly. And when you're ready to talk numbers, remember that the sticker price is just a starting point. Be prepared to negotiate on the price of the car, the value of your trade-in, and even the interest rate on the loan.
Okay, I'm ready to negotiate.
Don't be intimidated. It's all part of the process.
But I'll admit, the financing part can still be a bit confusing. What should I watch out for when I'm talking to the finance manager?
That's a great question. The finance office is where things can get tricky. They might use a lot of jargon and complicated paperwork.
Yeah, it's like they're speaking a different language.
That's why it's so important to ask questions. If you don't understand something, don't be afraid to speak up.
It's my money and my credit score. I have to be careful.
Exactly. And before you sign anything, make sure you understand all the terms and conditions.
Okay, I'm taking notes. Read the fine print, ask questions, don't be afraid to walk away. Any other tips?
Yes, actually. Remember when we talked about supporting smaller dealerships?
Yeah, those are the ones that might be struggling because of NexGear.
Right. So when you're shopping around, think about giving those independent dealerships a chance.
Okay, so I could save money by going to a smaller dealership. What else is different?
Well, independent dealerships often have a more personal touch. You might be dealing directly with the owner.
It's that small business vibe.
Exactly. And by supporting those independent dealerships, you're helping to create a more diverse and competitive marketplace.
I like that. I'm voting with my wallet.
Exactly.
So listeners, next time you need a used car, don't just go to the big dealership with all the fancy commercials. Check out the smaller independent options. You might be surprised. Now, is there anything else we should be thinking about when it comes to buying a used car?
Actually, yes. There's one more important aspect to consider. The environment.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. We've been talking about the financial side, but what about the environmental impact of all these cars?
Exactly. What happens to all those cars that get repossessed? And what about all the resources that go into producing and shipping millions of vehicles every year?
It's like we need to think about the whole life cycle of a car.
Right. And that brings us to a bigger conversation about sustainability.
Wow, we're going deep. I love how we start with one topic and end up exploring all these interconnected ideas, but I think we'll have to save the environmental discussion for another episode. We've already covered so much ground today.
I agree. That's a topic that deserves its own deep dive. But before we wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a few final thoughts.
Okay, I'm listening. Okay, so we've gone deep on the financial side of the used car world. We've learned some practical tips for buying a car. And we even touched on the environmental impact. But I think it's important to take a step back and think about the big picture.
I agree. This isn't just about cars. This is about systems.
Exactly. This is about how power is concentrated and how competition can be eroded and how small businesses are facing all these challenges and how it all ultimately affects us as consumers.
And it's important to remember that all these things are connected. Our individual choices, the policies we support, the businesses we choose to give our money to, it all shapes the kind of world we live in.
So where do we go from here? What can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Keep learning about these issues. Ask questions. Don't just accept things at face value.
Right, like we've been doing in this deep dive.
Exactly. And beyond staying informed, we can make choices. We can support local businesses. We can advocate for policies that are fair. And we can hold corporations accountable.
We have power, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Right. And change is possible. It might not happen overnight, but we can make things better.
I feel so energized after this conversation. We've learned so much about the used car market.
And this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
That's what makes the deep dive so exciting.
It's a journey of discovery.
And we're on this journey together with our listeners.
So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. We hope you learned something new.
And maybe you even feel inspired to make a difference. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep questioning the world around you.
Because when we understand the systems that shape our lives, we can start to create the change we want to see.